Good afternoon and welcome to the Foreign Press Center. My name is Erin Eddy and I am a Foreign Service Officer. As a member of the State Department's Disability Action Group, it is an honor to introduce our briefer today, Special Advisor for International And before she travels to Vietnam on Friday, she's here today to brief about her recent work leading high-level meetings with Chinese officials on disability rights. After Judy's remarks, we'll have a session for Q&A. If you'd like to ask a question, please wait for the microphone, then state your name and your media affiliation. Thank you very much. And Judy, the floor is now yours.
Thank you very much, Erin. So it's really a privilege to be able to be with you today. I wanted to give you a little bit of information about my background and how I got into the work that I'm currently doing. It was an honor for me in 2010 to be asked to serve as the Special Advisor for International Disability Rights. This was a position that was created by President Obama as a result of the disability community asking that we elevate the issues of disability, not just domestically, but internationally. And so, for me, having had polio in 1949, growing up in Brooklyn, New York, where at that time there were no laws that protected the rights of disabled individuals, and like many disabled people of my age group around the United States, and for that matter around the world, there was little thought about human rights or civil rights or equal rights for disabled individuals. And so little things like going to school when I was 5 years old, which most children did in the United States. When my mother took me to school, I was not accepted, and I wasn't accepted into school because I was unable to walk up steps, even though my mother hadn't asked for any types of assistance for me to go to school. And over the course of my lifetime, we've seen many dramatic changes, and I think the dramatic changes in the United States have been inspired very much by disabled people coming together, forming organizations, many of them cross-disability organizations, where people came together to go beyond just discussing what our problems were, but rather to look at the kinds of solutions that we wanted to secure. And I think that was a very important time in many of our lives when we realized, looking at other civil rights movements, like the movement that was going on in the United States in the 1960s, the civil rights movement, the women's movement, the aging movement, the anti-war movement, all of these activities were happening. And with the advent of television, which younger people just assume was always there, many of us who had disabilities like myself, where we weren't able to really move about the community because there weren't basic things like ramps on streets, and buses weren't accessible, and trains weren't accessible. Buildings were not accessible, apartment buildings, business offices, many, many places. And so being able to have television and radio was very, very important, as well, obviously, as the printed press. And I think those mediums which were moving forward in that period of time, really beginning to slowly show what was happening in the United States in the broader community, inspired many of us in the disability community to realize that not only should we discuss our problems, but we had to discuss solutions. And in discussing those solutions, you can see in disability, like in many other areas, we really started at the grassroots level. You start working on change in the community that you live in. And so that's why if you look at the history in the United States, you'll see that cities and states were the ones that began to make changes in local and state laws. But in the 1970s, we saw a significant number of pieces of legislation passed, one which prohibited discrimination against disabled people in any programs receiving money from the federal government, we call that Section 504. It was basically modeled on the Civil Rights Act of 1964, but it only covered government. It didn't cover the private sector. Between 1973 and 1990, there was a lot of activity in the United States working to broaden the legislation. And so in 1990, we saw the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which was a really momentous occasion in the U.S. This was a bipartisan piece of legislation that covers both the public and private sector. This year, we'll be celebrating the 25th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act. The State Department will be involved with our embassies around the world in the celebration of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Secretary Kerry has asked all of our embassies around the world to, in fact, link the July 4th activities to include aspects of the celebration of the ADA. So I think for myself, what I've been able to see, both with my activism, but equally importantly, I think what many of us realized is every individual person could try to work on change individually, but the types of changes that we were working on and still work on are changes that need to change systems. They need to reform both the public and private sector. They need to enable people in our communities to have an understanding that disabled people can make the same contributions as others if the barriers that have been placed before us get removed. And I think that's really what has inspired me over many, many years to also learn about what's going on internationally. So I've been doing international work since about 1972, when by fluke I happened to go to the Paralympic Games in Heidelberg, Germany. And that was the first time I'd ever been out of the United States, and it was the first time that I met disabled people from all over the world. And it was really, I am not an athlete. I'm a cheerleader without a lot of knowledge about the sport, but I love to watch the sports. But it was great, really, to be able to talk to kindred people from all over the world and get a better understanding that while the United States and European countries had more money and we were able to do certain things more than developing countries, at the end of the day, we were all facing very similar problems. Stigma, because people didn't believe that disabled people could make equal contributions. And moving away from what we call the medical model, moving away from cure of disability to looking at a human rights, a rights-based approach. And so I worked in the nonprofit world for about 20 years in a community group called the Center for Independent Living, and then was involved in setting up an organization called the World Institute on Disability, which did public policy work in the US and internationally. Again, looking at what other governments were doing and civil society groups were doing to identify and resolve basic areas of discrimination and good public policy being developed. I had the privilege of working in the Clinton administration in the Department of Education for the 2 terms that he was there. And there we were working on a number of areas, one significantly on the issue of education for disabled children in early childhood, primary and secondary education. And these are issues that are still being addressed in the US and countries around the world. I think we all know that education is really the framework that children need. If children are not able to get a decent education, whether they have a disability or not, they're not going to be able to make contributions to society. And ultimately, the failure of disabled people to be able to make contributions results in an economic drain on countries. Countries that are poorer, where people can't work, who have disabilities, but where other families, other people in their families are likewise not able to work because either a child or an adult needs to stay home to help ensure that the disabled person is able to live their life. My work at the Department of Education was very important because it was an opportunity to work in the United States government on the inclusion of education for disabled children in the United States. But we frequently met with counterparts in other countries who were really looking at the issue of what we call inclusive education. Could disabled children go to school with regular children or with non-disabled children? And what our law has been basically showing is yes, disabled children can go to school with non-disabled children. Some of them need to get additional supports in the classroom, but we see that as an obligation as a part of our legislation. So children in primary school, high school, universities can get what we call reasonable accommodations, supports in the classroom to be able to basically achieve what they're able to achieve. I worked at the World Bank for a number of years. That was also a great opportunity to begin to work with the UN family and also with other bilateral governments to look at what they were doing and to look at the impact of collaboration. And then finally, I had the opportunity to come here to the State Department. I travel very frequently, and my travels really have enabled myself and colleagues at the State Department here in Washington and our embassies around the world to really begin to reach out to disabled people in communities around the world, as well as to talk with governments and to offer governments the opportunity to share information about what we've learned over these many decades, and an opportunity for us to be able to learn from governments about what they're doing. And equally important, I fervently believe that it's very important that we have very strong civil societies. Nonprofit organizations are critical. We see this in countries all over the world to really enabling disabled people and others. This is certainly not an issue just in the area of disability, but more broadly, to be able to express their views. It's an opportunity to come together, to go apart is the way I like to describe it. And whatever the areas of interest that one has, I think these organizations are very important. We've had the privilege in the last year to go to China twice at the invitation of the Chinese government. And when we've been on these visits, we've met with government officials. We've been invited over by the China Federation for Disabled People. We've had the opportunity to spend some time with Zhang Haidi, who is the chairperson of the CDPF, and to meet with other members of the CDPF. Likewise, we've also been meeting with people from civil society in China to be able to talk with them about issues that they're trying to address. And again, this common thread of the removal of stigma, the ability to have the right to education, the ability for people to see that disabled people are capable of working and want to make the same contributions as everyone else in their society. We were also invited in November. The Chinese headed up APEC this year, and they had a side event on disability, and we spoke at that side event. There were a number of representatives from other governments and civil society from around the world, and we commend China for taking the leadership role on putting together this side event on disability. They've established something called the Group of Friends, and the U.S. is a part of the Group of Friends, and we are continuing to work with them on advancing the Group of Friends. So let me very briefly explain the first U.S.-China coordinating meeting. The Chinese asked last year at one of the official meetings between China and the United States that we have a meeting where we would be able to focus on the issue of disability. I think many of you know that China has been interested in advancing issues affecting disabled people, and we have, as I've been saying, been very interested to continue to talk with the Chinese. And so the meeting that we held on April 14th, I think was a very productive one-day meeting where they had a delegation that had a few representatives from government agencies and a number of representatives from the China Disabled People's Federation. The United States had a delegation which was composed of representatives from multiple government agencies. So we had senior representatives from the Department of Justice, the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission, the Department of Education, and a number of others, as well as representatives from civil society. We had a representative from the National Council on Independent Living. which is an organization here that is an umbrella group for community-based organizations called Centers for Independent Living, and a representative from a national parent technical assistance center. Our discussions primarily focused on employment and education. We had representatives from the private sector, United States Business Leadership Network, and a representative from the business community. And we had discussions also on the role of civil society in the United States, which I think was very productive. And we had a panel that focused on the role of the private sector in the United States and what the private sector is doing to advance employment opportunities for disabled people. We also had a representative from the Office of Personnel Management here in the United States, which is the federal agency that has responsibility for implementing the President's executive order, whose goal is to employ 100,000 disabled people over the course of the President's terms. So that day was concluded with the Chinese asking that we agree to holding another meeting next year in China, which we have agreed to. We were lucky that we were able to go beyond just one day of discussions. We also had a second day that our office worked with the Chinese on, where they spent half a day with the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission, getting much more in-depth information on Title I of our Americans with Disabilities Act, which is the employment provision in the Americans with Disabilities Act. And in the afternoon, we spent the afternoon with George Washington University. China is moving forward on bringing more disabled individuals into higher education, and we wanted them to get an understanding of the model that's used in many college campuses. So the president of GW introduced the afternoon, and then there were a number of presentations, both focusing on the kinds of graduate work that GW was doing, reinforcing an issue that we had discussed on Tuesday, which was the importance of teacher training, as an example. In order for disabled children with more significant disabilities to be able to participate in education, it is important to have teachers who've been trained. And so we focused on that issue, and that was part of what happened at the meeting at GW. But GW also, most of the discussion focused on faculty members with disabilities and disabled individuals with all types of disabilities. Seth, he is from GW, and Seth was one of the presenters. But we had representatives who were deaf and low vision and multiple disabilities, and people with learning disabilities and psychosocial disabilities. It was a real broad presentation, which we hope enabled the Chinese to see that over time our laws have really focused on enabling people, regardless of their disability, to be able to participate in life. And we addressed issues like accommodations to testing and obligations of new construction needing to be accessible, and on and on. So, and then Thursday and Friday, the Chinese had a number of additional visits. They visited an inclusive elementary school, Bethesda Elementary, on Friday morning, and they also visited our transit authority here and met with our access board to learn about U.S. standards and how they're developed, and then to also get an opportunity to ride go on and off an accessible bus and learn about our train system. So I think those 4 days overall were like a 50,000-foot look at what was going on here. But I hope and I believe that it was a productive meeting, and I think the Chinese saw it as such, because we put a lot of time into this. So let me just say that our office responsibility of working across the world is a real privilege, and we are really addressing many, many issues, but the focus of our work is really the inclusion of disabled people into the human rights agenda of the State Department, foreign policy work of the State Department. And I think at the end of the day, what we've seen in our country and many countries around the world is, as barriers are removed, people who have disabilities, regardless of their disability, are beginning to be seen more as equal members of society, and people are learning that the removal of barriers really, in fact, is an economic value that all countries should be pursuing. So.
Thank you so much, Judy, for those remarks. We'll now open up the floor to questions. I ask that before you receive the microphone, please state your name and your media affiliation.
Hello, thank you for your wonderful presentation. My name is Chuanqi Shu from Voice of America Mandarin Service. My question is about China. One of China's problems regarding infrastructure and the policy for the disabled people. We know that in China, in cities, China has the infrastructure and policies, but they are oftentimes not put into good use. For example, like the accessible sidewalks are oftentimes blocked by cars and by other irrelevant stuff. So how does the government put the good policies into good practice, and what's the United States experience in implementing such policies? Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you very much for the question. So infrastructure is very broad, but if we narrow it down to one of the examples that you just gave, so having ramps on streets but cars parking in front of them. That's a problem, of course, here in the United States, and it's one that it's a state's issue. And so we've seen that many states in the United States have passed legislation which results in a fine. So if someone is parked illegally, or if we have parking areas for disabled individuals, and if someone illegally parks in those areas, in some states the fine can be as high as $500. In some states they've actually hired disabled individuals to go out and monitor parking areas. It's a paid position, and to issue tickets to individuals who are violating that aspect of the law. But on the broader issue of infrastructure and construction, one of the reasons we had offered the Chinese the opportunity to meet with our Access Board is the Access Board is a U.S. federal agency, and it's composed of about 51% federal government agencies that have responsibility for standard setting, like in housing, in transportation, the post office, things of that nature. But 49% of the board is also comprised of non-governmental representatives, and those people are nominated by the sitting president and confirmed by the Senate. And this body establishes standards, so for new construction, for example, and for renovation. And they've gotten much more in depth over the years. So they're dealing with playgrounds and boats and many areas. Laws like the Americans with Disabilities Act and others have enforcement provisions. And this is something that we speak with civil society and governments all the time, that the importance of good laws also means that there are good enforcement provisions, and that the enforcement provisions have to be more than on paper, but there has to be a way of implementing those enforcement provisions, which means in the case of the United States, we have multiple government agencies that have responsibility for enforcement. We discourage enforcement only from one agency because typically, like Agency X doesn't really have authority over Agency Y, but you want to have the implementation requirements across the federal or state agencies that have responsibility, because then they understand the issues and they can more effectively implement the requirements to enforce laws. I think we've also seen on the issue of implementation of laws, and we discussed this at the coordinating meeting with the Chinese. So the U.S. government has put money into technical assistance. So for example, with the Americans with Disabilities Act, the Department of Justice has supported regional technical assistance centers on the Americans with Disabilities Act since about 1992. And regional meaning there's, I think, 10 technical assistance centers around the United States, and they work with people in their region, and not just disabled individuals, but they'll work like with the business community because the law covers the business community. Anyone can call and ask a question. So they can call and say, I'm going to a doctor's office, I need an interpreter, what's the obligation for the doctor's office to provide it? Or I'm blind and I need an accommodation. Or I'm a business owner, what is my obligation? I have 25 employees, I have 15 employees, I have 10 employees. And they are not an advocacy, these technical assistance centers are not advocacy entities. They are there to work with people and understand the law and want to understand what the law does and what the law doesn't do. And likewise for the parent organization that we had at the coordinating meeting, they receive money from the federal government to provide technical assistance to parent training information centers around the United States. There are 80 to 100 of them. And their obligation is to help to provide technical assistance to these centers so that they clearly understand a particular law, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and they provide materials and they have a conference and various other things. So we have an interest in people knowing the laws and knowing what their rights are. And some of the agencies have like mediation, like the Department of Justice has a free call-in line. Anybody from around the United States can call with a question. This is separate from the technical assistance centers. Justice also offers mediation. So let's say you and I have a disagreement. You're a company and I'm an individual person and I have a complaint. We can mutually agree that we're willing to sit down with a mediator to try to mediate the problem. And there's a program within Justice to do that. So we look at enforcement very seriously. And again, enforcement of disability laws is really similar to enforcement of other civil rights laws. And since it's the Department of Justice that oversees much of the enforcement that goes on in disability laws, they also do in race and other areas.
Looks like we have another question here in the front. If you would wait for the microphone, please.
Hi, thank you. Lo Xiaodong with China Daily. Can you talk a little bit more about on what specific areas that U.S. and China can collaborate? And is there a focus set for next year's meeting? You mentioned this year the focus is employment and education. Yeah, thank you.
So in answer to your second part of the question, we haven't yet had any follow-up discussion, but I presume that certainly education and employment will be two areas that we would continue to discuss, because I think we had productive discussions and they're issues that we're both working with domestically, and I would be surprised if we didn't continue to talk in those areas. I think we have a lot in common, and that is that there is a growing interest in China to really address issues like the number of disabled children that are not yet in school. I mean, obviously in China there's some very big issues, numbers of people in rural communities. And for example, one issue that we've talked to the Chinese about is our belief that it's better not to continue to build separate schools for disabled children, but to use the money that you would be using to construct new separate schools and to make existing schools accessible, and to use some of those funds to be able to train teachers at teachers' universities on how to work with students who have disabilities, how to make accommodations, adaptations, so that disabled students can learn math and learn reading and writing and the basic subjects that both our countries believe are important for our children to be learning. And in the area, for example, of higher education, common areas, was not that long ago. I mean, really looking at the United States, you're looking at these changes really in earnest starting in the late 1960s. Things started to change after World War II. at the state level, but not to the degree that we started seeing changes in the late 1960s and 1970s. So given the history of China and where we are, it's to be expected that China is, working on making changes. And from our perspective, not just with China, but with countries around the world, we think it's very important that we share information on what we believe we've done wrong as well as what we believe we've done right. And in the United States and in many other countries, for example, when we started educating disabled children, it was much more the model of educating children not in regular schools. Teachers were not being trained to support disabled students in regular classrooms. So we've learned over the years, because much of what we've had to do is dismantle what was in place. Likewise for institutions. In the United States, we've certainly had many, many institutions, and those institutions have been quite large. If you look at any of the history in the United States, institutions for people with mental health disabilities, institutions for people with intellectual disabilities. But now, over the last 20, 30 years, 40 years, there's been a real push, and the courts have been supportive of both moving people out of institutions and keeping people in the community. So again, we've spoken with government officials in China, CDPF and others, about how we believe it's very important not to be building any more institutions in the area of mental health. And the way we've been able to address that issue, and countries in Europe and others have been able to address that issue, in part has been by having community-based organizations that can provide quality services for people at the local level in the community. And so those are areas that I think of common interest. And like in the United States, some of these things didn't really happen so naturally. These kinds of changes, I think, so as I was saying earlier, I've been very involved since I was young. And when I was first involved in the movement, many people said things about myself and my friends about, how we were not acting appropriately, and how we shouldn't be supporting inclusion of people with disabilities because of whatever. But now, people don't say that any longer. Now people, 40 years later, see that what we were working for was right. And I think the vast majority of people in the United States see it that way. So I would say, coming and visiting programs here and learning about how we've closed down institutions, what kinds of supports we have in the community, what the role of government and the private sector is. I think those are some areas that we can really learn from each other. I mean, when I was in China both times, and last time I was in Shanghai, Shanghai was great. They have really good accessibility. Their trains were great. I could get on and off the train. We just traveled by ourselves. We didn't need any special transportation. They had accessible taxis there. Many of the buildings were accessible. In Beijing, we visited the old city, and the Forbidden City, and it was amazing the changes that they had made there, because I was first in Beijing in 1995 as a part of the U.S. delegation for the UN Women's meeting with Mrs. Clinton, and there basically couldn't go to the Forbidden City. Now we were able to go. We talked a little bit with our counterpart in the meeting that the elevators at the trains in China, in Beijing, have keys, and people didn't know where the keys were. And that we had that problem here in the United States also, with keys for buses or keys for trains, and how that really didn't work. And so keys are by and large something that we've done away with here. So there's really a lot in common.
That's fantastic. Okay, we have time for another question.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Sophie Richardson. I'm Human Rights Watch's China Director. I have two very quick questions, Judy. The first is, although China has signed and ratified the CRPD, it still has lots of laws and regulations on the books that are very much in tension with that. And one I'd like to ask you to update on is a set of regulations that allows universities in China to reject applicants because they have disabilities, even if there is no basis whatsoever for limiting that kind of access on a substantive basis. So I'm wondering if that came up in your discussions and if the U.S. is actively pushing for those to be repealed. And since you raised the issue of civil society, the U.S. has spoken quite with a great deal of concern recently about the crackdown on civil society in China. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on your particular concerns and also how you think restrictions on civil society negatively impact on the fight for disability rights inside the country. Thanks.
Thank you. So as I was mentioning earlier, with our meeting over at GW, one of the issues that we specifically spoke about was how students do not get rejected based on disability. And the director and others there explicitly explained how, and we used GW as an example. We were very clear that the GW program is similar to programs all across the United States because of obligations under Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. And we also talked about the issue of testing with EEOC more broadly, so it wasn't just in the area of higher education. And I believe that by having Chinese meet with both faculty who had different types of disabilities, who were full professors in a number of different departments, that also was an example of what is happening here and how we're really looking at people's qualifications. So, you know, if I wanted to be an engineer and I was rejected, that would make sense because I would never be able to be an engineer. But if I wanted to be a social worker or a human rights advocate or a lawyer or a teacher, whatever, I'm qualified to do that. So rejecting me just because, as I was rejected, so I need also to say that my first real formal job that I applied for was to be a teacher in New York City. And I took all of the prerequisite courses. And at that time, we had no law. This was 1970. And I took a written exam, a medical exam, an oral exam. All of those exams were given in inaccessible buildings, which today would be illegal. I passed the written exam. I passed the oral exam. And they failed me on the medical. And the specific reason I was failed was paralysis of both lower extremities, sequelae of poliomyelitis, which meant I was specifically rejected because I couldn't walk because I had polio. Today, that would be a gross violation. No government official would be stupid enough to ever write something down like that. But at that point in time, you know, they didn't think anything about it. So I was lucky. I was able to get a couple of attorneys. We went to federal court, sued the Board of Education, and the judge basically directed the court to do another medical exam. And it was very ironic because we had the first African-American woman on the federal bench as our judge. So, I mean, I couldn't have scripted it any better. But I say this because issues of discrimination, employment, and other areas still absolutely exist in the United States. The issue for us here is we do have laws that protect our rights. And so that was what we spoke a lot about. On the issue of civil society, we were there, as I mentioned, twice. And last November, I was concerned that we had heard that there were some people who we had meetings set up with who were encouraged not to come and meet with us. And that was very distressing to me because, you know, we're just talking about issues of common areas of importance, sharing information on how we've been doing different things. And there have been some other incidents this year. And so we continue to speak out about the important role of civil society. And I mean, I also have to say that I think what government said about the disability community in the 1970s and what government says about the disability community in 2015 are dramatically different, because I think governments here and in countries around the world recognize that the people who are dealing with the issue, in our case disability, but whatever the issue is, listening to people and learning from people about what they see as the problem and working collaboratively together on resolving problems is where I think we all need to go. I mean, we define it here in the United States as a healthy tension that exists between government and the civil society. And so I'm pretty open about the discussions in China and any country that we're visiting, because I think it will assist progress, constructive, healthy progress to be made in China, Vietnam, Korea, Brazil, Europe, wherever it may be, that the empowerment of the voices of, in our case, disabled people, but others, only makes for a stronger society.
Fantastic. Other questions? Yes, Kathy.
Hi, I'm Kathy Wolf, and I'm with Independence Today. I just wondered, Judy, does China define disability different than we do? Because I was reading in some of the background material, there seemed to be a difference, and in terms of how they defined it, how they counted persons with disabilities. Could you speak about that, please?
Sure. It's a very good question. Thank you. So the definition of disability is different from country to country. The United States has a broader definition than many other countries. So, for example, in China, diabetes is not considered a disability. For us, for the purposes of the Americans with Disabilities Act, diabetes would be considered a disability. In other words, if a person who had diabetes applied for a job and they were denied the job because of diabetes, then they would have a right to be able to file a complaint and may well have a finding in their favor. Likewise, for epilepsy, epilepsy also isn't considered to be a disability, and what we call learning disabilities, dyslexia, dysgraphia, in many countries around the world, this is an issue that's really a new one, and in China it's still not considered. I would say it's something that they're really beginning to get a better understanding of. We discussed dyslexia over at GW because one of the students has dyslexia, and I think it was a good discussion between China and the US on what we see dyslexia as and why we consider it to be a disability. So China, for example, says that they have 85 million people with disability out of 1.3 billion, I think. We have 300 and some million people, and we say we have 59 million people with disabilities. So we've also raised this issue with China. I know China has been doing some good work on improving their data collection. So they've been collecting better data, their numbers have gone up. But going back to something I mentioned earlier, the World Report on Disability, which was written by WHO and the World Bank, that says 15% of the world, at least 15% of the world's population, or 1 billion people, have disabilities. 15% of China's population is bigger than 85 million.
Kathy, do you have a follow-up question?
No.
Okay. Other questions for Judy? If there are no other questions, Judy, I'd like to offer you the chance to make any closing remarks.
Well, just to say that I think it's a privilege to work at the State Department, and I'm glad there are a number of colleagues here today from other government agencies as well as civil society groups and the media. I think as people learn more, as the issue of disability gets discussed more in the media, I think the media is very important in how it portrays disabled people. So it can, look at disabled people as hopeless individuals who need the charity of government and individual people, or it could look at disabled people as being able to be contributing members of society. And I think when we look at disabled people, like we look at gender, for example, so for many, many, many years, women weren't receiving education for many different reasons, but ultimately the woman's role was not to be educated and contribute. We've seen all over the world today that as women have been able to get into schools, that the value of education for women has a profound effect in their communities. And likewise, in the area of disability, people are beginning to see that removing the barriers that preclude disabled people or have precluded disabled people from participating in society allows people to participate, and I think it's becoming much more an acceptable norm that people recognize that the contributions of our society from disabled people is very important. So thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for your important work on disability rights as human rights and disability rights as civil rights. And on behalf of the Foreign Press Centers, I would like to thank everyone for joining us. This concludes our briefing. Thank you.